On July 4, 1961, deep beneath the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean, a Soviet submarine drifted nearly 300 feet below the surface. From the outside, everything seemed calm, silent, invisible, and routine. But inside that vessel, a nightmare was quietly unfolding. A group of men stood in front of a sealed compartment door. They knew exactly what waited on the other side. The moment they opened it, they would be stepping into something far worse than fear, something that could cost them their lives in the most painful way imaginable. Yet despite knowing this, they had no choice. This is the story of what happened inside that submarine, a story of desperation, sacrifice, and one of the most terrifying nuclear incidents in naval history. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. To understand how this disaster unfolded, we need to go back to the tense years of the Cold War, a period unlike any other in human history. Beginning in the aftermath of World War II around the mid-1940s, two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, entered into a silent but deadly rivalry that would last for decades. This wasn't a traditional war with constant battlefield fighting. Instead, it was a global standoff filled with fear, espionage, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. Tensions ran so high that even ordinary citizens felt it in their daily lives. In the United States, children practiced duck-and-cover drills in schools, preparing for nuclear attacks. Families built fallout shelters in their homes, hoping they would never need them. By the late 1950s, the situation had escalated dramatically. Both nations were locked in an intense arms race, developing increasingly powerful nuclear weapons. The danger wasn't just in using these weapons, it was also in the possibility of accidents. Around this time, the United States introduced a major advancement, the USS George Washington, the first nuclear-powered submarine capable of launching ballistic missiles while submerged. This was a game-changer. It meant nuclear strikes could be launched from anywhere in the ocean without warning. The Soviet Union, determined not to fall behind, rushed to develop its own version. That project would become the K-19, a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine and the first of its kind in the Soviet fleet. Construction of the K-19 began in October 1957 near the White Sea. From the very beginning, speed was the top priority. The Soviet Navy wanted this submarine completed as quickly as possible to match the American threat. But this urgency came at a cost. Engineers and designers raised concerns early on, particularly about the reliability of the reactor's cooling system. These warnings, however, were largely ignored. Cutting corners saved time, but it also introduced dangerous flaws into the submarine's design. Incredibly, the K-19 was completed in just under a year, around 359 days. While this was seen as an achievement, it was also a red flag. For comparison, a similar American submarine had taken over 500 days to build. Even before it officially entered service, strange and troubling events began to surround the K-19. During its ceremonial launch, a long-standing naval tradition was broken. Instead of a woman christening the ship by smashing a piece of champagne against the hull, a man performed the ritual. To make matters worse, the bottle didn't even break, it simply bounced off the hull. Among sailors, this was considered a terrible omen. As work continued, more issues began to appear. In early 1960, a serious mistake during reactor testing forced the submarine to return for repairs. The damage was costly, and several crew members faced consequences, including demotions and replacements. Then came an even stranger incident. During maintenance, workers discovered dozens of small black beetle-like insects inside the reactor components, specifically in the graphite grease around critical bolts. What made this discovery so bizarre was that these insects were still alive, moving despite being inside a high-temperature, high-radiation environment. Samples were sent to a research institute for analysis, but no explanation was ever given. To many involved, it began to feel like the submarine was cursed. Despite these warning signs, the project moved forward. Naval officers had their doubts about whether these early nuclear submarines were truly safe for combat, but speaking out could lead to serious consequences, so most stayed silent.
The crew members themselves also kept quiet. In fact, to encourage sailors to serve on such dangerous vessels, they were given better food and living conditions than usual. Meals included items like smoked fish, sausages, cheese, and even chocolates, luxuries compared to standard naval rations. Finally, in July 1960, the submarine was officially commissioned and sea trials began. But once again, problems appeared almost immediately. During deep dives, leaks were discovered in the hull. The outer rubber coating began peeling away. Repairs were needed again. Still, despite all these setbacks, the K-19 was eventually assigned to the Soviet Northern Fleet later that year. For a short time, things seemed stable, but that wouldn't last long. In 1961, tragedy struck again when a crew member was killed during a missile loading operation. And that was just one of several deadly incidents. Fires, toxic gas leaks, and flooding events plagued the submarine. Over time, multiple workers lost their lives before the vessel had even completed a full operational cycle. Yet somehow, the K-19 continued its missions. In June 1961, the submarine was deployed on a major training exercise in the North Atlantic known as Polar Circle. The mission involved navigating through simulated enemy defenses and operating under harsh Arctic conditions. After more than 2 weeks at sea, the submarine began its journey back to base. On July 4, 1961, while cruising deep beneath the ocean, most of the crew were resting. Conditions seemed normal, but at 4:15 in the morning, everything changed. An alarm suddenly sounded in the reactor control room. At first, it seemed like a routine warning, but within moments, the officers realized something was terribly wrong. The pressure in one of the reactors had dropped to 0. This wasn't just a malfunction, it was a catastrophic failure. A tiny component, a pressure sensor tube, had ruptured. Though small, this part was critical. Unknown to the crew, it had been weakened during earlier testing and had developed a hidden crack. Now, it had completely failed. Coolant began leaking out, and without proper cooling, the reactor core started overheating rapidly. And although the system automatically shut the reactor down, the damage was already underway. Temperatures inside the reactor began climbing dangerously, reaching levels that could soon lead to a meltdown. And there was one terrifying problem. The submarine had no emergency cooling system.
With the reactor temperature rising uncontrollably, the situation aboard the K-19 had turned into a race against time. There was no backup cooling system, no proper safety net, and if the reactor core continued to heat up, it could lead to a meltdown, or worse, an explosion. In the middle of the Cold War, such an event could easily be misunderstood as a nuclear attack, potentially triggering a catastrophic global response. Captain Nikolai Zatiev understood the gravity of the situation immediately. Within minutes of the alarm, he ordered the submarine to surface. The vessel emerged from the depths at approximately 4:22 a.m., running on its remaining functional reactor. But surfacing didn't solve the problem. It only bought them a small window of time. The overheating reactors still needed to be cooled, and there were no safe or standard procedures left to follow. At first, the captain briefly considered a grim option, abandoning hope altogether. But that thought passed quickly. Instead, he gathered his officers and made a decision that would define the fate of everyone on board. They would attempt to build a makeshift cooling system. The plan was simple in theory, but horrifying in execution. Teams of sailors would enter the reactor compartment and construct a temporary pipeline to deliver water directly into the overheating core. The goal was to reduce the temperature before it reached critical levels, but there was a deadly catch. The reactor compartment was flooded with intense radiation, levels far beyond what the human body could survive. Despite this, volunteers stepped forward. They were organized into small teams of 2. Each group would enter the compartment for only a few minutes at a time to limit exposure. Even so, those few minutes were enough to deliver potentially fatal doses of radiation. Their protective gear was almost useless. Basic gas masks and thin clothing offered no real defense against the invisible threat surrounding them. Inside the compartment, conditions were unbearable. The air was thick with heat and smoke.
Electrical cables sparked and burned. Visibility was low, and all the while, radiation silently attacked their bodies at a cellular level. One of the first to volunteer was a young officer named Boris Korchalov, just 23 years old. He led the initial team into the reactor room. Before he entered, the captain asked him if he fully understood the risk. His response was calm and steady. He knew exactly what he was walking into. Moments later, he disappeared behind the heavy door. When he returned, the effects were immediate and devastating. He collapsed, tearing off his mask, vomiting violently. His skin had turned a deep red, already showing signs of severe burns and radiation damage. And yet, the work continued. Team after team rotated through the compartment, each enduring the same horrifying conditions. They welded pipes together using whatever materials they could find. They fought small fires while trying to complete their task. Every second inside increased their exposure. The human body can only withstand a limited amount of radiation. For reference, a dose of around 4 to 5 sieverts is often fatal. Inside that compartment, levels were estimated to be 10 times higher. Still, they kept going. Eventually, after multiple attempts and countless sacrifices, the crew succeeded in assembling a basic cooling system. Water from the submarine's reserves was redirected into the reactor. Slowly, the temperature began to drop. From over 400 degrees Celsius, it decreased enough to prevent a full meltdown. By around 8:45 a.m., the immediate danger had been contained, but the victory came at an unimaginable cost. Radiation had already spread throughout the submarine. Contaminated steam entered the ventilation system, exposing nearly everyone on board. There was no safe area left, no place to hide. All 139 crew members had been exposed to significant radiation levels. For those who entered the reactor compartment, the damage was catastrophic. Within hours, symptoms of acute radiation sickness began to appear. At first, it started with nausea, vomiting, and dizziness, but quickly it escalated into something far more severe. Their skin became inflamed, turning deep red and eventually blistering. Swelling distorted their faces. Some became unrecognizable within hours. Blood spots appeared across their bodies. They experienced intense pain, fever, and extreme fatigue. Many suffered from internal damage that couldn't be seen, organs failing, bone marrow shutting down, immune systems collapsing. Some began vomiting repeatedly, a clear sign of extremely high radiation exposure. Despite the medics' efforts on board, there was little that could be done. Treatments for such exposure were limited, especially in those conditions. Meanwhile, communication with the outside world was also compromised. The main radio system had been damaged, making it difficult to send a distress signal. Eventually, a backup transmitter was used to send a simple but urgent message requesting help. Hours later, another Soviet submarine received the signal and changed course to assist, even though doing so meant entering a contaminated zone. Rescue efforts began the next day. Crew members were evacuated in stages. Many were too weak to move on their own and had to be carried. To prevent further contamination, they were stripped of their clothing before being transferred. It took time for full medical support to arrive, but eventually the survivors were transported to a naval facility for treatment. Back on land, the true extent of the damage became clear. The human body relies on bone marrow to produce blood cells. Radiation had destroyed this critical function in many of the affected crew members. As a result, they developed severe infections, internal bleeding, and organ failure. Hair began falling out within days. Skin peeled away in layers. Some experienced bleeding beneath their skin and even internal hemorrhaging. Doctors attempted advanced treatments, including blood transfusions and experimental procedures, but the outcomes were often grim. Several of the most severely exposed crew members died within days. Others survived for weeks or months before succumbing to radiation-related illnesses. In total, dozens were seriously affected, and many lost their lives over time due to radiation-related illnesses. But despite the tragedy, the actions of the crew had prevented something far worse. If the reactor had exploded, the consequences could have extended far beyond the submarine itself, potentially escalating into an international crisis. However, for years, the full truth of what happened was hidden. The Soviet government kept the incident classified. Survivors were required to remain silent, and official records were altered. It wasn't until decades later that the real story began to emerge. The K-19 itself was eventually repaired and returned to service, but its reputation followed it. Over the years, it was involved in additional accidents, earning a grim nickname among sailors. Finally, after decades of service, it was retired. Today, the events of July 4, 1961, are remembered as one of the most serious nuclear incidents in naval history. More importantly, it stands as a powerful reminder of human courage. The men who walked into that reactor compartment knew they might not come back. They understood the cost and still chose to act. Their sacrifice prevented a disaster that could have changed the course of history. And because of them, the world never knew just how close it came.